Not who I was going to pick, but somebody worth taking a look at. We're back with another deep dive, and it's time to look at the man who changed the territory. George Scott. Prior to booking, George was a part of one of the most successful tag teams of the era in the 50s and 60s. With his brother Sandy, the Flying Scots would become a top tag team in every territory they were in, from Stampede Wrestling to Georgia to Jim Crockett Promotions. And it was his stay in Jim Crockett Promotions, assuming that that would set him up for his stay in returning to the promotion in 1973, because his last championship reign came in early 1973 with his brother, and he would retire later that year. Ironically enough, 1973 was also the year, I believe it would be April 1973, when Jim Crockett Sr. was passed away, and John Ringley, his son-in-law, took over the promotion. And the first major decision by John Ringley as owner of Jim Crockett Promotions was to bring George Scott in as booker. And George would begin to transition some of the homesteaders out of the territory and start to change the perception of the region of Mid-Atlantic. Tag team to singles. Transitioning the territory from a tag team territory to a singles territory was the first thing on George's checklist. Names like Rip Hawk and Swade Hansen, or teams like Rip Hawk and Swade Hansen, George Scott and Sandy, George Becker and Johnny Weaver, the interns with the interns, and a whole host of other teams. Back in the 60s and the 70s, Jim Crockett Promotions was a tag team territory more than anything else, and really did not it really wasn't much of a singles region. You know, it wasn't known for a singles territory. Outside of holding the regional title, the United States title, because that's what the world title was in a lot of territories in this era, you really did not have a major title. It was not a major hub city for wrestling in this era. When when the world champion came in, when it was Gene Kaninsky, or Dory Funk or anybody, when they would come in, George Becker, Johnny Weaver, usually Johnny Weaver would be the one that gets the title shot. Tag team wrestlers would be the ones that would challenge Funk or Gene Kaninsky or Jack Briscoe. During this time, Florida was the go-to place for world champions, or Texas was the go-to place for world champions, or Missouri was usually the go-to place for world champions, aka Lou Thesz, Harley Race, Gene Kaninsky to a point. If you want to constitute Gene Kaninsky as more Canadian, then there's that. But George would bring in Wahoo McDaniel, Johnny Valentine, and Super Destroyer as the main top stars to start righting the ship and changing the perception of the region from tag team to singles. And by recommendation of Wahoo McDaniel, or through the recommendation of Wahoo McDaniel, Ric Flair would find his way to Jim Crockett Promotions. Jeremy Snuka would find his way to Jim Crockett Promotions as another young star brought into the territory, as would Roddy Piper. And others would follow soon after. The Funks would find their way to Crockett Promotions. Blackjack Mulligan, etc., etc. I know I'm glossing over it, but George Scott would help set the groundwork or lay the groundwork for Crockett Promotions' future, because transitioning them away from the singles territory, from the tag team territory, and rehabbing and re-establishing the territory and changing the perception of the territory to make it a big money town, and getting rid of a lot of the homesteaders and sending the homesteaders that had been there for 10, 15, 20 years out of the territory, and either asking them to step back or changing how they were viewed in the region, set the stage for Crockett's big years in the 1980s. But for the most part, Crockett would have to do that without George Scott, because after 8 years in the territory, 73 to 81, George Scott would leave after a pay dispute with Crockett, and that would start the revolving door for Crockett, but it would also, again, continue to set the stage for Crockett Promotion. Basically what I'm saying is, after George left, Crockett Promotions had a little bit of growing pains and a little rough go, but would honestly be better off after he left. And you can't say that a lot of the reason why Crockett Promotions was so good after George left, because of the foundation laid by George Scott. But either way, George would leave and head over to Georgia Championship Wrestling and assist Jim Barnett for a short run, give or take about 2 months. And then during that time, he was also offered by the International Wrestling Association, a promotion in Canada, a struggling promotion in Canada, also known as the company that Dino Bravo used to have a partnership in, offered George Scott a spot to become a partner with the promotion, but George would ultimately decline that spot, and instead would eventually, in 1983, join the WWF at the request from Vince Sr. to help Vince Jr., who had just taken over the promotion, learn how to run a wrestling company. The first thing George would have to do in his new advisory role was going to the Georgia office and handle the transition after Black Saturday. If there's anything that George Scott knew, it was Southern wrestling. And one of the first things George Scott had to do was go down to the Georgia Championship Wrestling, go down to the office where Georgia Championship Wrestling was, and handle the tapings and the whatever needed to be done as far as integrating WWF into that spot in the Georgia time slot after Black Saturday, when WWF bought out Georgia Championship Wrestling. George would also, the following year, help with the negotiation, or be the main go-between for the Hearts and the WWF in the negotiation to purchase Stampede Wrestling, as Keith Hart was Stampede's liaison and George was WWF's liaison. Also, George Scott was directly involved in the planning of WrestleMania 1, WrestleMania 2, and the first Saturday Night's Main Event. You can applaud George for being involved in the planning and the negotiation with Mr. T to be a part of WrestleMania 1, and you could applaud him for his part in Saturday Night's Main Event, but would you really applaud him? Is that really something that you want to take credit for, being a part of the planning of WrestleMania 2? Because WrestleMania 2, God, if there was ever a clusterfuck. Like, legit. If you'd think that you could do a better job with a WrestleMania outside of... How can you think that 3 different venues for one show over the course of a night is a good idea? New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, ending in, of course, Los Angeles, starting in, of course, New York at the Coliseum. I don't know, it might have been a financial success, but as far as being a good WrestleMania, there's a reason why WrestleMania 2 is usually on the bottom of the list, only beaten out probably by WrestleMania 9 and WrestleMania 16 as some of the worst WrestleManias in history. Props to him for being a part of the planning, but I wouldn't want to take credit for it if I was him. In 1986, so soon after, I'm assuming soon after WrestleMania 2, George would leave WWF and head for an open booking job in World Class Championship Wrestling that was left by Ken Mantell, who had just made the jump to Bill Watts, opening up, taking a spot opened that was opened by, I believe, the departing Bill Dundee. And this was actually the talent exodus for World Class that did not help the promotion. There's a lot of, rumors and innuendo about when George actually took the spot as booker for World Class, whether it was before Kerry's accident, whether it was after Kerry's accident, whether it was right after Ken Mantell left, or right before. Either way, it doesn't really matter. What matters is George Scott ended up in World Class and did not stay long, partially because of Gary Hart, and partially because he booked a match and did not tell the competitors in the match that it was a loser leaves town match. So let's just say the partnership didn't work out. And then if you've heard Jim Cornette talk about this, which you probably have if you've heard Jim Cornette talk, because Jim Cornette has spoken about this on various occasions because of his status in the company at the time, after leaving World Class, things would go silent for George Scott for a little bit because he was only in World Class for a little while before Gary Hart returned and took the book back from George Scott, which is one of the reasons why George wanted Gary out of the territory, because he felt Gary was a threat to his job. But George would end up back finding another booking job, this time in the same company that he had his greatest success, World Championship Wrestling, aka the newly renamed Jim Crockett Promotions. George would start in late 1988, soon after Crockett Promotions was bought out by Turner Broadcasting. In November, George was brought on to replace Dusty Rhodes, and George was much like in the situation with John Ringley back in 1973. George was brought on as the first move by Executive Vice President Jim Herd. George Scott would not last in WCW, much like his time in World Class Championship Wrestling, as he would start in 1988 and be gone by the spring of 1989, and would be replaced by a booking committee. George Scott did not last because he was not prepared. He was not ready. He had not adopted to a change in time. But we'll get to that. We'll get to that. George's legacy, it's like I said earlier, George Scott, without George Scott, I highly doubt that Jim Crockett Promotions would have become one of the biggest and most successful territories during the height of the territory era. Because Crockett Promotions was, at one point, the place tag teams went to become a success. That if you made it in Crockett Promotions in the 60s or the 50s, then you were a success. But not as a singles wrestler. If you wanted to be a singles wrestler, you would go to New York or Florida or Texas or Missouri, or somewhere like that. You would not go to Crockett. But once Johnny Valentine came, and once Wahoo McDaniel came, and once the singles wrestlers were main eventing and drawing the crowds and getting people talking, that's what changed the territory. And it's because of George Scott. Interestingly enough, George Scott was a tag team wrestler most of his career, but he knew how to book the single stars. And without him, I don't think, without transitioning to a singles territory, it's doubtful the territory would have been as successful as it was. Because tag team wrestling would have ran its course if it stayed in the spotlight for all that time. And just think about Ric Flair becoming a success in Crockett Promotions. If Crockett Promotions wouldn't have become a singles territory, would Flair have become a single success, or would Flair and Valentine have never broken up, and Ric Flair and Greg Valentine would have been the tag team? But since Crockett Promotions became a singles territory, the rest is history. It became the place to be, and it became the company with one of the deepest talent rosters in the history of pro wrestling. Look at Crockett Promotions in the mid-'80s and tell me that the foundation that was laid in the early 70s and the mid-'70s did not play a part in people wanting to go to Crockett Promotions. And his part in planning some of the biggest WWF events in history cannot be understated. Except WrestleMania 2. That could be understated. As I was going to say earlier, George never stopped. The reason why, near the end, as you head into the 1990s, the reason why, in my opinion, things didn't continue on the successful route for George Scott is because he never changed. You know, he never went a different route with his career. He never let his booking ability change. He would always rely on the same quirks and the same things and the same ideas, and never actually adapt to a new era. You know, he would always rely on the house shows. He never booked weekly television. You know, as he was booking Crockett Promotions, as he was booking, you know, it was the early days of weekly television. In his time, wrestling was focused on house shows. Wrestling was specifically fixated on house show business. So when he was told they're doing a free TV big event and they gotta promote it, he's like, no, because we have to save Flair and Steamboat for the house shows. Because that was how he booked back in the 1970s, and his ability made the territory. But the fact of the matter is, he also never changed. He also never trained somebody to become the next generation of George Scott. He never taught somebody how to book. He never sat somebody aside and had an assistant like Eddie Graham did, like Dory Sr. did, like Vince Sr. did, like Dusty Rhodes did, like Kevin Sullivan did, like Eddie Gilbert did, like Jerry Jarrett did, you know, etc., etc., etc. The list goes on and on and on. George never did that. In my opinion, had George learned how to book weekly television, became more adept in, you know, the idea that wrestling has changed, and accepting of the idea that wrestling has changed, then I think he would have been able to be a solid choice to book the new WCW. But he was unwilling to learn. He was unwilling to accept the fact that wrestling has changed. That doesn't change the fact that he's one of the top 5 bookers of all time. I mean, not one of the top 5, but he is definitely one of the top 10. And it doesn't change the fact that he does have a positive legacy in the wrestling business. It's just another one of those people that did not step aside and adapt when wrestling changed. George would have a part in Paul Jones's promotion, South Atlantic Pro Wrestling, in the 1990s. It was a short-lived independent company in the Mid-Atlantic region to try and capitalize on the fans that were leaving WCW, but financially it was never sustainable. Ultimately George would pass away in 2014. He would pass away in 2014 at the age of 84. And it cannot be understated the legacy that George left behind in the wrestling business as just one of the most creative minds of the territory era. George Scott would succumb to cancer in 2014 after being diagnosed 3 years earlier, and ultimately would leave a lasting legacy in the wrestling business. Yes, he's not Mr. Controversy like Jim Cornette, but very similar to Jim Cornette, George Scott didn't want to adapt and integrate little aspects of how wrestling had changed to how he knew wrestling to be. I'm not saying Cornette's wrong, I'm just saying sometimes adapting is harder than it's made out to be. And it's not the easiest thing in the world to do when you've done it the same way for such a long time. At this point, if you like deep dives, let me know down in the comment section below what your opinion is of George Scott and his booking ability and his legacy in the wrestling business, and if you think that wrestling is better off how it used to be, where they relied more on house shows, and if you wanted to see something, you would come to the house show as opposed to watching it on weekly television, and there not really being big monthly events or monthly shows that you build to like it would become in the 1980s. Either way though, leave a comment, leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more content just like this that you can only find right here at Wrestling Express, and I'll see you next time.